Section 267.
Members of the Chair, what you might have noticed in the recorded interview, there are portions where it skips around. The reason it does that are there redactions that have been made to the videotape by myself to exclude extraneous or irrelevant material from you. So don't speculate as to what the redactions were. They're done for legal reasons.
Thank you, Your Honor. Taking you up right before the lunch break, Detective Sheehan, do you recall the portion of the interview where it stopped?
Yes.
And did you stop the interview at that particular time?
It was stopped shortly thereafter, yes. The actual interview, yes.
And for what reason did you suspend?
Mr. Alemany appeared to be getting sick.
And as a result of that, did you give him anything?
I'd given him water, he was given food, and then I notified EMS.
Okay. And where did he appear to be getting sick?
He appeared to be throwing up into a barrel.
And for how long a period did that take place?
I would say about 45 minutes to an hour.
Okay. Did you look in the barrel after that?
I did.
Did you see anything in the barrel?
No.
You said you called EMS. Did they respond?
They did.
Okay. In your presence, was Mr. Alemany evaluated?
He was, yes.
Directing your attention to March 11th of 2014, sir, what contact, if any, did you have with Mr. Alemany on that date?
A collection of a buccal swab.
Okay. And as far as that collection of a buccal swab, what is a buccal swab?
It's a swab of the inner cavity of the mouth for DNA comparison.
And where did you wind up delivering that swab on the same day?
To the Boston Police Crime Lab.
That's all I have. Thank you, Detective.
Dan?
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Detective.
Good afternoon.
How are you, sir?
Good, thank you.
Well, we're going to play a little bit more of that tape, if you don't mind, just to get some more background about how he was that day. We could have that tape now, Your Honor?
Yes.
And then I'll have some questions for you, sir.
Okay.
Hey, bro. Hey, bro. I tell you what, that might be from the antibiotics, because you got nothing in your the Motrin and stuff. The Motrin, you know, you should, sometimes it says take that on a stomach. So, that's I eat them, we eat them with Clip Bars. Okay? You all right? Hey, Edwin. Why are you sick to your stomach? Are you thinking about what you did? Hey, Edwin. Look at me. That's stress.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Jury, later on in the trial, when I give you my legal instructions concerning the law in this case, one of the doctrines I'll instruct you on is the voluntariness instruction, which deals with whether or not statements made by a defendant are the product of his own free will, rationally given. And that's a question that goes to the jury to make a determination. The government has to prove the voluntariness of every statement. So keep that in mind as you watch the videotape as well.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome.
So what you thought is their TV show? Huh? daughter's favorite TV show? Dora. Anything else? My Little Pony? Scooby-Doo? It's gonna be a little too big for Sesame Street to stop now, right? She still likes it? Yeah. You got a bike, a big wheel or anything? You want to take a break? Edwin? Edwin, you got something on your mind you might want to share with me? You know what it's about. I mean, be cautious. Yeah, when we get some text coming down. Oh, fuck. Do you think, do you need to go to the hospital? Hey, well, they're gonna ask you if you get punched or kicked on that side. You need to go to the hospital, Edwin? You don't know? Okay. Oh. Edwin, I'm going to stay with you, all right? I'll give you a shot again. He goes over and do some medical stuff, right? Okay? All right? Try and sit up a little. Put the bucket in your lap. Just try and sit up as good as bends over. Edwin, we're going to have some EMTs come down and check you out, okay? Ow. Ow. Hey, Edwin, why don't you try to think of something nice? Think about you doing something with your daughter or something like that. Try and take your mind off the pain, all right? What's the last fun thing you did with your daughter? Talk to me. Oh, shit. Edwin? Let's talk about something nice. Look, why don't you do this? Look at me. Stay strong. What's your daughter's favorite singer? Gentleman conversation, what you say, stay with me, okay? Edwin, can you answer the question? Think it's the Chinese one? Want some gum? Take the clip off. You're gonna throw up, man. Go ahead, throw up. You know what I mean? Throw up. Don't worry about that. I'll stay here with you, okay? What type of pain is it? Sharp stabbing pain, sharp throbbing pain. Stabbing pain.
Detective,
Yes.
earlier on in the interview, thank you, sir. Earlier on in the interview, either you or your partner said to Mr. Alemany, "We know all about your past. We know all about people like you who can't control yourself." Do you recall that?
Yes.
And be fair to say that you are very familiar and were that night with his criminal history?
That morning,
Oh, excuse me, that morning, yes.
I had a limited knowledge of it.
And at that point, did you have a limited knowledge also of his mental health and mental illness history?
I had no knowledge of that history at that point.
Okay. When did you come to understand that?
Throughout the course of the investigation,
But at that point, you did not know anything about it at all.
I did not.
Had you known that he had been hospitalized frequently and periodically ever since he was about 12 or 13 years old?
No.
What did you do? What information did you seek before you had that interview with him about his past?
The only information that we had at that time were prior incident reports that had been created by the Boston Police Department.
Had you realized that he had been, from about age 13 on, had been essentially a ward of the Division of Youth Services, DYS, and had been in a lot of institutional placements?
Was I aware that he had a criminal history? Yes.
That he'd been committed to DYS from ages 13 to 18?
Yes.
Were you aware that as part of that, excuse me for 1 second, just let that go by. So it would be fair to say that then you were unaware that while he was committed to DYS for that at least 5 or 6 year period, that he had been transferred to psychiatric hospitals for major mental illnesses?
Was I unaware of that?
Yes.
Yes, at that time.
And you had no knowledge then of any of the antipsychotic, antidepressive medications he'd been taking for about a decade and a half, correct?
No.
Did, as part of your checking him out at that point and gaining information, did
No.
You heard your partner say that you have a GED, don't you? You heard him say, yes, yeah, I do have a GED that he got in prison, yes?
Yes.
Were you aware of that? Your partner was. Were you aware of that night? That morning, excuse me?
My partner nor I were aware until he stated it to my partner at that point. Prior to the interview, we weren't aware of that, no.
Had it come to your attention that in the years that he'd been committed to DYS or been in different houses of correction that he had made multiple suicide attempts?
No.
You were unaware of that?
Completely.
Did you have any awareness of the self-mutilations that he repeatedly did?
Again, this was 6 hours, 7 hours after his arrest. I had a very limited history on Mr. Alemany. I was aware of his criminal record.
A person of interest in others, correct?
Yes.
And it would also be fair to say, given the physical evidence that exists in this case already, and what would appear to be the absolute, respectfully, looniness of the alibis he was giving you, you knew from the get-go that when you were asking him to give you further information about his alibis, that you were simply trying to bring him in, basically get him to incriminate himself more, because you knew those alibis were impossible, yes?
Actually, at the time of the interview, a lot of the information he was giving us, we didn't have the later information we received as to where his whereabouts of his arrest for Kaylee Valentine's stabbing, and just several hours after the discovery of Amy Lord's body in Stony Brook Parkway. All that information came in after this interview was conducted. We were working with limited information at this point.
And I understand that. But I also understand that your questions to him, how did your blood get on Gate Street and Telegraph Street if you weren't there? Can you begin to explain that to me? Does that not suggest that the notion that he wasn't there was not something that was even remotely possible to you?
It was a calculated gamble that was in fact his blood, because at that point I didn't know definitively that it was in fact his blood.
But you did see a lot of blood on him, correct?
On him at that point?
Yes.
No, he had a possible Johnny
so
on him.
you saw it on his clothing that you sent out that was sent out for the criminal lab review, correct?
There was blood on his clothing, yes.
And there was a lot of blood. There was a blood trail both inside and outside Kaylee's house. So it was a pretty good calculated gamble, wasn't it?
I'd like to think so, considering the results we got back, yes.
I think that's it for me, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Crowe.
Thank you, Detective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph Ross?
Sir, do you solemnly swear the testimony will give the jury and the court in the cause now hearing should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you, sir. You may proceed.
Just want you to sit right here. Thanks. Good afternoon. Inquire on?
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Could you please introduce yourself to the court and to the jury and spell your name?
Yes, my name is Joseph Ross. Last name is spelled R-O-S-S.
And, sir, what do you do for a living?
I'm a criminalist with the Boston Police Department in the DNA unit.
And how long have you been in that position for?
It's been about 6 years now that I've been in this position.
Okay, and can you describe your responsibilities at the Boston Police Crime Lab?
Sure. I perform DNA testing on casework samples. I help maintain the day-to-day operations of the laboratory, performing maintenance on instruments, things like that. I provide technical review of other analysts' work and also provide expert testimony when necessary.
In your present position, Mr. Ross, have you always held that position at the lab, or did you do something different before for a period of time?
No, that's the same position I've had since I started. Bachelor of Science in Molecular and Cell Biology from the University of Connecticut. I also have a Master of Science in Forensic Science from the University of New Haven.
And did some of your coursework focus on or involve DNA?
Yes. Specifically, that would be biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, and statistics. Those 4 courses are required to be a full-time DNA analyst.
You've been working at the crime lab for how long at the Boston Police Department again?
Right around 6 years.
And is that an accredited lab?
It is.
And describe the accreditation status of the Boston Police Crime Lab, please.
Sure. So our laboratory has been accredited since 2002. Accreditation is a process where outside agencies come in. They look at our protocols. They look at our case files. They basically check to make sure that our quality is up to where it should be. Every year we do our own internal audits. Every other year we are accredited by a company called NFSTC. That's the National Forensic Science and Technology Center. They come in every other year. They look at our case files. They look at our protocols. They make sure that the quality is to where it should be. Every 5 years we're accredited by what's called ASCLD Lab. That's the American Society of Crime Lab Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. And every 5 years they come in and they accredit us.
And presently you're a DNA analyst?
Yes.
What type of training do you have to go through to become a DNA analyst for the Boston Police Crime Lab?
In our laboratory, typically it's an extensive training procedure. It's usually around 6 months or so. It's performing all the possible procedures and protocols that you would perform on normal casework. It's at the end you're given what's considered a competency exam. Your supervisor knows what the answer to that should be. You process it as if it were normal casework. You provide your comparisons and your results to your supervisor. If the results are correct, you're allowed to begin casework.
In the DNA section in particular where you work, do you have proficiency training?
Yes.
And what is that?
So twice a year I'm proficiency tested. What that is an outside agency sends us DNA samples. It's basically a fake case, a mock case. We process it as if it were normal casework. We provide them with our results, and if the results are correct to what their results say that the results should be, we're allowed to continue on casework.
Do you use controls in your casework?
We do.
And explain for the jury what that term means relative to your work.
Sure. So controls are samples that we add in with our casework samples to help us analyze the data. We may have something called a negative control. What that is, it's no sample whatsoever, but it's processed the whole way through with all the other casework. So basically just an empty tube. All the chemicals are added as if it were normal casework. We have an expectation of no DNA profile from that sample at the end. If we get a DNA profile from that sample, we know something went wrong. We also have positive controls where we have an expectation of a certain DNA profile at the end. And if we don't get that DNA profile, we know something went wrong along the way.
Mr. Ross, do you use controls in all your DNA testing at the lab?
Yes.
We've talked a lot about, in these preliminary questions about DNA. What is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the blueprint of growth and development. You get half of it from your mother, half of it from your father. It's about 99% the same between all of us. That's why we're all born with 2 eyes, 2 arms, etc. It's that 1% that we can sort of key in on or zoom in on in forensics to help differentiate people based on their DNA.
And where do you find it?
It's found in bodily fluids such as blood, semen, saliva.
Could you describe for the jury what it means to develop a DNA profile?
Sure. So if you think of a profile in general, profile of anything, a profile of a car, what you do is you list off a certain characteristics. So for a car, you would say it's a black Mazda 2002, etc. Each one of those characteristics makes up that car's profile. Basically what we're doing in DNA is the exact same thing. We're determining DNA characteristics at different locations, and that together makes up your DNA profile.
And are you familiar with the term forensic?
Yes.
And what does that word mean as it relates to your work?
It's the scientific aspect helping with the law, basically.
So how do you use DNA profiles as you just described them for forensic purposes?
So for forensic purposes, we can develop a DNA profile from an evidence sample, a sample from a crime scene. We can then develop a DNA profile from a known sample, so what we call a reference sample. Often that's in what we call an oral swab, taken directly from someone's mouth, usually a swab of their cheek. It can also be a sample of blood taken directly from the person. When we process that sample and we get a DNA profile, we know that that DNA profile came from that person. That is that person's DNA profile. We can compare that reference sample to the DNA profiles from the evidence samples and determine whether or not somebody is included or excluded from the DNA profile from the evidence sample.
And in your work, as a DNA analyst, have you ever excluded anyone as being the source of a biological piece of evidence?
Yes.
At the lab, what types of DNA tests do you use?
We use what's considered PCR-based testing.
And what does that mean? Explain for the jury what a PCR test is.
PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. So PCR is basically the process where we zoom in on that 1% difference between all of us that I was talking about, the variable sections of DNA between all of us. We zoom in on those locations and we make a ton of copies of those locations. So we can then visualize that person's DNA profile.
You've described forensics in forensic testing at your lab. Is this PCR test used for other applications other than forensic testing?
Yes, PCR is used in clinical diagnostic testing. It's used at hospitals, other places like that, yes.
And could you describe for the jury what a PCR-based DNA typing test is?
So like I was saying, it's where we zoom in on, we use chemicals basically to zoom in on that 1% difference of DNA that's variable among the population.
Relative to your appearance here today, Mr. Ross, did you conduct certain DNA testing relative to certain crime lab case numbers?
Yes.
And was one of those crime lab case numbers 130536?
It was.
And what incident did that involve, sir?
That was an assault and battery with a deadly weapon.
Mr. Ross, I want to ask you to take a look at this chart and ask you if you recognize the photographs and tables on this chart, sir.
I do.
And what do you see in front of you?
This is a DNA table of results, as well as photographs of pieces of evidence.
And this table of results that you see here, are you familiar with it?
I am, yes.
How so, sir?
This is the table of results for some of the testing that I performed in this case.
And the photographs of the items that appear on this board, are you familiar with those photographs, sir?
I am, yes.
And how is that so?
I was made aware of where these items are from, the items that I tested, where they are from, and these photographs represent that.
Mr. Ross, I'm just going to put exhibit number 268 up on the easel, and with the court permission, ask you to step down.
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So this first column here, labeled as item number, this shows what item was tested, basically. So the first two here, we tested 130536, that's case number 130536. Item 3, SW1, that stands for swab 1. The other item up here is 130536, item 4, swab 1.
And with respect...
swab what?
Swab 1.
With respect to the line in the blue, the next cell over to the right, what was the description of 130536, item 3, swab 1?
That was RDS from sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street. RDS stands for Reg From State.
And the second row in white, 130536, item 4, swab 1, what was the description of that item?
That was RDS from sidewalk of 47 Gate Street.
Those swabs, where did you receive them from?
Those swabs were provided to me in DNA by criminalist Catherine Hall.
And what did you wind up doing with respect to those particular swabs?
Those swabs were processed for DNA testing.
And let me ask you this while you're up there. Are you familiar with what a reference sample is?
Yes.
And what is a reference sample?
A reference sample, as I was alluding to earlier, is a sample taken directly from someone. Oftentimes it's an oral swab taken directly from somebody's cheek, or it can be blood taken directly from somebody. When we process that DNA profile, we know that is that person's DNA profile.
And how do you use a reference sample in your PCR DNA testing?
So the reference samples are compared to the evidence samples, and we can determine if somebody is included as a source of DNA or excluded as a source of DNA.
Okay. Now, just for a minute, I want to direct your attention to the middle two rows in between the photographs, the blue and white lines.
Yes.
Okay. And could you describe what items those are right there, sir, starting with the far left columns?
Here we have 130536, item 42. That is RBS stain 3 from right collar of shirt.
Okay. And the next line?
130536, item 68. RBS stain 6 from right thigh area of pants.
And those two stains that you just described, items 42 and items 68 respectively, where did you wind up receiving those stains from?
So I also received those from criminalist Catherine Hall. Those were received as stains. They're cuttings taken from items. So I don't actually, in DNA, I don't actually receive the full item, a full shirt or a full pair of pants. The criminalist who examines the clothing will take cutting, a representative cutting, and send that on to me for DNA testing.
And you recognize the two articles of clothing that appear on the exhibit that you're referencing right now based on your preparation for your testimony here today?
Yes.
Now, starting with the bottom two lines on the exhibit before you, what do those bottom two blue and white lines represent, sir?
Here we have 130538, item 103. That is an oral swab from Edwin Alemany. That's what would be considered a reference sample taken directly from the person. We also have 130536, item 26, an oral swab from Kaylee Valentine.
Now, regarding this particular exhibit, 268, did you wind up testing the items that are reflected on that particular exhibit as part of your role as a DNA analyst? Yes. And what were the results of your DNA testing, sir?
So just to explain this chart very quickly, each one of these columns, this D8, S1179, D21, S11, etc., each one of those is a different location of DNA that you have within the body. These numbers represent the DNA characteristics at that location. So like I said, you're going to get one characteristic from mom, one characteristic from dad. It can be the same characteristic that you get from mom and from dad. So in any single source sample, a sample that is not a mixture, that there's not more than one person contributing, we're going to be expected to see two DNA characteristics at each location, one from mom and one from dad.
Okay. And did you complete the testing relative to the items that you've just referenced on exhibit number 268?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
So the testing here showed, you can see for 130536, item 3 swab 1, RBS from the sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street. At this D8 S1179, you can see there are two 15 DNA characteristics. The DNA characteristics are just represented by numbers. At the next location, there's a 28 characteristic and a 31.2 characteristic. And as you can see as we go across, there are two DNA characteristics at every location. This location here that says AML, amelogenin, that's the sex-determining character location. Males are XY, females are XX. Now RBS from sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street, that's 130536, item 3 swab 1.
Can we just stick with that one for right now?
Yes. That would be considered a single source sample, no more than two characteristics at every location. I compared that DNA profile to my two reference samples down here, the oral swab from Edwin Alemany and the oral swab from Kaylee Valentine. Kaylee Valentine was excluded as being a contributor to, or as being the source of DNA from this profile. You can see, even at just the first location here, she has an 8 characteristic and an 11 characteristic. In the piece of evidence, it's two 15 characteristics. She's excluded from that sample. Edwin Alemany has two 15 DNA characteristics. So far, he's still included, but we look at the entirety of the profile. We look at every location. At this next location is D21S11. There's a 28 characteristic and a 31.2 characteristic. Edwin Alemany has a 28 characteristic and a 31.2 characteristic. And if we go across the board, all of the DNA characteristics in the evidence sample, RBS from sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street, match the DNA characteristics from Edwin Alemany.
And as part of your testing, do you come up with any statistics relative to your testing, any statistical significance?
Yes.
And what's the statistical, significance of the DNA results that you just described regarding the reddish-brown stain from the sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street?
Your Honor, do you mind if I refer to my notes?
Yes.
I'm assuming his memory is not...
But I don't think he has
I don't know where the numbers memorized. So we never say that somebody is 100% definitely the source of DNA. We provide a relevant statistic for how many other people would be expected to have those exact same DNA characteristics. The way we do that, we know the frequency or how often these DNA characteristics are seen in the population. We can determine how often all of these characteristics combined would be seen in the population. In this case, it would be 1 in 570 quadrillion Caucasians, 1 in 3.2 sextillion African Americans, and 1 in 4.5 quadrillion Southeastern Hispanics. Now, if you think of 1,000 has 3 zeros after it, 1,000,000 has 6 zeros after it. A quadrillion is a number with 15 zeros after it. A sextillion would be a number with about 21 zeros after it.
And so just put that in perspective, if you could, Mr. Ross. What does that mean, if you could put that into perspective for what that means in relation to the oral swab from Edwin Alemany?
He is included as the possible source of that DNA. And these DNA characteristics would be expected to be found in those numbers. The population of the Earth is about 7 billion or so.
And moving on, can you tell the jury what your results were from the second item, the reddish-brown stain from the sidewalk of 47 Gate Street?
Yes. The DNA profile, or the combination of DNA characteristics in the RBS from sidewalk of 47 Gate Street are actually the same as the RBS from sidewalk of 55 Telegraph Street. The conclusion is the same. Edwin Alemany is included as a possible source of that DNA profile. Kaylee Valentine has to be the source of that DNA profile.
And what was the statistical significance of the DNA results that you received?
Statistical significance remains the same. All of those DNA characteristics are still represented in that profile. The RBS from sidewalk 47th Gate Street. That would be 1 in 570 quadrillion Caucasians, 1 in 3.26 million African Americans, and 1 in 4.5 quadrillion Southeastern Hispanics.
So for Southeast Hispanics, you'd expect to find that DNA profile in the last number you just gave?
Yes, it would be 4.5 quadrillion. So I would expect to have, I would have to gather 4.5 quadrillion Southeastern Hispanics to find these exact same DNA characteristics at every location.
And Mr. Ross, continuing on in the exhibit number 268, could you go to the middle 2 rows now, starting with the blue, what the test results were from RBS stain 3 from the front right collar of the shirt?
Yes, RBS stain 3 from the front right collar of the shirt, you can see is the same DNA characteristics as the other 2 samples. DNA characteristics again match the DNA characteristics from Edwin Alemany. He is included as a source of that DNA. Hidden Valentine is excluded as a source of that DNA. The statistics are the same as they were for the other 2 samples.
And relative to the reddish-brown stain number 6 from the front right thigh area of the pants, what were your test results relative to that, sir?
For the RBS stain 6 from the front right thigh area of the pants, the DNA characteristics, once again, are the same across the board, across all 6